The sun was setting on the sprawling estate of Harold Bancroft, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth and power. But as the golden rays of light bathed his mansion, the only thing on his mind was his dog, Max. Max, a scruffy terrier, had been by Harold's side for over a decade. To the outside world, Harold was an eccentric billionaire who cared more about his stocks and collections than his own family. But the truth was more complicated. Harold had never found the kind of loyalty he desired in human beings. His family had become distant, but much of that distance had been his own doing. In his younger years, Harold had been a devoted family man, but his business soon consumed his time and energy. He spent long hours building his empire, and the more successful he became, the more emotionally detached he grew from his children, Richard and Elizabeth. They had once adored him, but as he became more obsessed with his work, he was rarely home. His wife, Margaret, had been the glue that held the family together. She had a passion for animals and had adopted Max shortly before she passed away unexpectedly. Margaret's death devastated Harold. Unable to cope with the loss, he threw himself further into his work, emotionally shutting out his children. Max, Margaret's dog, became his only source of comfort. The little terrier reminded Harold of the life he had once known, of the love he had lost. He poured all his affection into Max, seeing the dog as the last connection to his wife, but in doing so, he became even more distant from Richard and Elizabeth. Now, as Harold's health was failing, he reflected on the choices he had made. The doctors had given him only a few months, and Harold knew the end was near. It wasn't death that bothered him. It was the thought of leaving Max behind. He feared what would become of his loyal companion in the hands of a family he felt no longer cared for him. The day of Harold Bancroft's funeral was an event. The who's who of the business world attended, reporters snapped photos from a distance, and the family tried their best to look grief-stricken. In truth, most of them had already moved on from Harold's death, focusing instead on what they believed would be their windfall. After the funeral, the family gathered in the estate's grand drawing room for the reading of the will. Harold's lawyer, Judith, stood at the head of the room, holding the document that would decide the future of Bancroft's fortune. The room was tense. Richard leaned back in his chair, confident. His sister Elizabeth sat next to him, already imagining how she'd spend her share. Cousins, nieces and nephews, all distant relations who hadn't visited Harold in years, waited eagerly. Judith began to read. "To my family, who have shown interest in my wealth over the years, I leave you with a piece of advice. Money does not buy loyalty, nor does it buy happiness. I have witnessed this firsthand." The room shifted uneasily. "I leave 1/5 of my estate to my son, Richard, and 1/5 to my daughter, Elizabeth. The remaining 3/5 of my estate, which includes all my investments and assets, will be placed in a trust for the care of Max, my dog." The room erupted in disbelief. Richard's face turned red with anger, while Elizabeth looked as if she couldn't believe her ears. Judith raised her hand for silence. "I'm not finished. The care of Max will be entrusted to my most loyal servant, Henry. As long as Max lives, Henry will reside in the estate and ensure Max's well-being. Richard and Elizabeth must spend 1 year living in the estate alongside Henry and Max to prove their loyalty. If Max passes naturally and no foul play is detected, a final clause will be revealed." Richard and Elizabeth stared at each other, speechless. Their father, always distant in life, had left them this absurd condition in death. What they didn't realize was that Harold had hoped this year would be a way to bring them closer to understanding what he had come to realize too late. As Richard and Elizabeth began their year at the estate, the tension between them and Henry was palpable. They were furious. This was their father's last insult. But the year forced them to reflect on their relationship with Harold and each other. Elizabeth, sitting in what had once been her mother's favourite garden spot, stared at Max, who was lazily basking in the sunlight. Her heart ached as she thought back to her childhood. She had adored her father, but he had always been too busy for her. When Margaret died, Harold became even more distant. She remembered standing in the doorway to his office, watching as he sat with Max on his lap. That dog had become her father's world, while she and Richard were left to grieve alone. "I tried, you know," Elizabeth whispered one night to Richard. "I tried to be close to him after Mom died, but he just shut us out." Richard sighed, his frustration softening. "Yeah, I know. It wasn't just about the money for me. I wanted him to see me, to acknowledge that I was more than just his son, waiting for his inheritance." They resented Max for years, not because he was a dog, but because he had become the stand-in for the love and attention they craved from their father. The realization that they had been competing with a dog for affection hit them hard. Living at the estate alongside Max and Henry, Richard and Elizabeth began to see the estate in a new light. They saw how much care Henry gave Max, and over time, they began to warm to the dog as well. Elizabeth, despite herself, found solace in the routine. She started walking Max in the mornings, talking to him as if he could understand her. Richard, who had been so angry at first, began helping Henry with tasks around the estate. He saw how deeply loyal Henry had been to their father, and though he had resented it at first, he started to respect the man's quiet devotion. Max, once the symbol of their father's favoritism, became a bridge between them. They learned that Harold hadn't been punishing them. He had been trying, in his own way, to teach them about love, loyalty, and responsibility. As the year passed, Max grew older and weaker. Richard and Elizabeth, who had once viewed the year as a punishment, now found themselves caring for Max as if he were part of their family. They had begun to understand their father's attachment to him. It wasn't just about a dog. Max had been Harold's way of coping with the loss of their mother, Margaret. In a sense, Max had kept Harold alive in the darkest moments of his grief. The day Max passed was quiet. Elizabeth held him as he took his last breath, tears streaming down her face. Henry and Sarah stood nearby, their eyes filled with sorrow, while Richard placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. The estate felt different without Max, emptier, but also more at peace. A week after Max's passing, Judith returned to the estate for the final reading of Harold's will. Richard and Elizabeth were no longer the same people they had been a year ago. They sat quietly as Judith began to read. "As you have fulfilled the conditions of my will, I now reveal the final clause," Judith began. "The remaining 3/5 of my estate, after Max's passing, will be divided again. 1/5 will go to Henry, in recognition of his years of loyalty and care. The remaining 2/5 will be placed in trusts for all of my grandchildren, ensuring that the next generation will be taken care of." Henry, who had always expected nothing, was overcome with emotion. Tears filled his eyes as Judith explained the provision. If Henry chooses to resign from his responsibilities, his share will go into a trust of Richard and Elizabeth's choosing. The room was silent as the weight of Harold's final gift settled over them. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about the love and loyalty that Harold had struggled to express during his life. After the will's final clause was revealed, Richard and Elizabeth came to a quiet understanding. They had spent years harboring resentment toward their father, but over the past year, they had learned that his intentions were never malicious. Harold had been a broken man, unable to connect with his children after the loss of his wife. In his own way, he had been trying to protect them from the same pain he had endured. Elizabeth and Richard approached Henry after the will reading. "We never realized how much you meant to our father," Richard said quietly. "Thank you for everything you've done." Henry, still moved by Harold's final act of kindness, nodded. "Your father loved you both. He just didn't know how to show it." Over time, the siblings grew closer to Henry and his wife, Sarah. They found peace in knowing that their father hadn't abandoned them, but had tried in his flawed way to teach them what truly mattered. Years passed, and the Bancroft estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, became a place of love and reconciliation. Richard and Elizabeth, now with families of their own, visited often, sharing stories of their children with Henry and Sarah. As Henry and Sarah raised their own children, Harold and Maxine, they made sure to pass on the lessons they had learned from Max, Harold, and the estate. The wealth was never important. It was the love, loyalty, and connection that had transformed their lives. In the end, Harold's will, which had once seemed like a cruel twist, became a legacy of kindness, teaching his family what he had learned too late in life: that true wealth comes not from money, but from the bonds we build with those we love.